Before we begin, please note in the comments which city you're watching from and what time it is there now. In a record book from the winter of 1893, preserved in a forgotten municipal archive, there is a short note, written in faded ink. 28 horsemen entered the Briarcrest region. No confirmed return. There is no signature. There is no conclusion. Just that dry sentence, interrupted as if the writer had stopped mid-thought. Briarcrest did not appear on official maps. It was a fold of high ground, a set of hills covered with dense pine trees, situated between secondary routes used by mule drivers and small traders. At the end of the 19th century, that place existed more in oral accounts than in documents. It was a cold territory, isolated in winter, where snow made any movement slow and silent. There the houses were far apart, made of thick wood, and time seemed to pass differently. In the center of these hills stood a building known as Winter Loft. It was not exactly a barn nor a house. It was an old elevated warehouse supported by wooden pillars, used to store hay, harnesses, and supplies during the harshest months. In the tax records of the time, the building appeared as shared property, with no clear owner. But in the testimonies collected years later, everyone associated the place with the same surname, Briarcrest. The Briarcrest twins, Abigail and Eleanor, were well-known figures, though little understood. They had lived together since the death of their parents in a simple house near the edge of the forest. They never married. They had no children. They did not actively participate in religious meetings or community gatherings, but they were not considered strange in the classic sense either. They were seen as reserved women, soft-spoken, always dressed in sober, almost identical clothing. Many residents said it was difficult to tell them apart from a distance. What was known about them came in fragments. Purchases made at the local store, signatures on supply documents, and scattered comments from neighbors who claimed to see them, sometimes accompanied by men from outside the community. Horsemen, freight drivers, young men passing through. None of this, taken alone, was noteworthy. Briarcrest was a region of passage. People came and went all the time. The winter of 1893, however, was different. Earlier than expected, heavy snow fell on the hills. The trails became narrow, the sounds muffled. Visibility decreased rapidly at dusk. It was against this backdrop that reports began to emerge of groups of horsemen asking about the winter loft. Some said they were looking for shelter. Others mentioned temporary work, cash payment, or supplies. There was always a plausible justification. According to the diary of a local merchant, dated December 3rd of that year, 4 men stopped by his store and asked if the road to the loft was still accessible. The merchant wrote that he answered affirmatively, although he found the sudden interest in that old building strange. 2 days later, the same diary records the passage of 6 more horsemen, then 8, then smaller groups, until the numbers began to blur. The pattern only became clear much later when a researcher gathered receipts, scattered notes, and belated testimonies. Adding up repeated names, vague descriptions, and approximate dates, he arrived at the number that now gives this case its title: 28 horsemen. No official record of departure. No confirmation of their return to their hometowns. No letters sent to their families after entering Briarcrest. The most disturbing detail, however, is not the number. It is in a note written in the margin of an incomplete police report, written weeks later, almost like a personal comment. The twins claim that everyone left before the heaviest snowfall. There are no witnesses to this. This sentence, forgotten for decades, marks the beginning of a silence that would never be fully broken. And it is precisely at this point, between what was written and what was never confirmed, that this story begins. To understand what happened in Briarcrest, one must observe what seemed normal. Records prior to the winter of 1893 do not point to a place in crisis. On the contrary, the hills were experiencing a period of relative stability, sustained by small trade flows and the constant movement of men on horseback, almost always alone, rarely accompanied. Daily life followed a strict rhythm dictated by daylight. At dawn, smoke rose from the chimneys, spreading a persistent smell of burnt wood and animal fat. The few residents knew each other by name, but kept a respectful distance. There was no excessive intimacy. In regions like this, survival depended more on caution than on trust. The Briarcrest twins were part of this scenario. Abigail was often seen early in the morning, drawing water from the well, always with slow, calculated steps. Eleanor appeared later, usually carrying small packages wrapped in thick cloth, destined for the winter loft. Neither of them seemed hurried. Their movements conveyed a kind of silent, almost ritualistic control. Testimonies collected decades later described the twins' house as overly organized by local standards. Everything had a defined place. Nothing seemed improvised. A neighbor stated that once, while helping to repair a nearby fence, he noticed that the windows were always closed, even during the day. Not out of fear, he said, but out of habit. The winter loft was part of this routine. During the summer and fall, the building received basic supplies: bales of hay, salt, tools. In winter it became a strategic point. Elevated off the ground, protected from moisture, it was ideal for enduring long periods of isolation. Although officially communal, in practice only the twins seemed to use it frequently. The riders who passed through Briarcrest that year came from different places. Some were acquaintances passing through, others complete strangers. The testimonies described tired men, many of them young, with worn clothes and few possessions. They had something in common. They all asked about the same place, always directly, as if they already knew exactly where they wanted to go. An old cash book from the local store records unusual purchases during this period: large quantities of dry bread, salted meat, and kerosene. Payments were made in cash, sometimes by different men, but always within the same interval of days. The merchant wrote in a side note that there seemed to be more mouths to feed than beds available. Despite this, no one reported any conflicts. There are no records of fights, threats, or violent behavior. On the contrary, the few descriptions of encounters with the twins speak of restrained cordiality. They offered temporary shelter, gave directions, and provided basic information. Nothing that could be considered out of the ordinary. Still, some details emerge in the more attentive testimonies. A farmer claimed to have seen, one afternoon, a group of horsemen heading toward Winter Loft shortly before nightfall, guided by one of the twins. What caught his attention was the silence. No conversation, no laughter. Just the rhythmic sound of hooves in the fine snow. Another resident mentioned that same week, he noticed horseshoe marks heading toward the loft, but few returning. At the time, he attributed this to the snow quickly erasing tracks. Only much later did he realize that this did not explain everything. The weather was also beginning to change. The cold intensified day after day. The nights grew longer. The wind blew through the cracks in the houses with a constant, almost suffocating sound. Briarcrest closed in on itself, as it always did in winter. In the official documents, there is no indication of alarm at that time. No formal complaints. No investigation initiated. Everything seemed to be following its natural course. But between the lines of these reports, a feeling grew that was difficult to name. An accumulation of small silences, a pattern that had not yet been recognized. And as the community prepared for the most severe snowstorm of the year, the last horseman was seen entering the path that led to Winter Loft, unaware that from that point on, they would cease to exist in the living records of the region. The night the last group of horsemen was seen entering Briarcrest appears in different records with slight variations in date. Some documents mention December 17th, 1893. Others point to the 19th. This inconsistency, common in isolated regions, already indicates the state of confusion surrounding the events. What can be said with relative certainty is that the cold had reached an unusual level. The snow fell in thick, heavy, almost silent flakes. The sky remained low, grey, and daylight disappeared too soon. The wind swept across the hills like a continuous lament, erasing sounds and distances. According to the testimony of a woodcutter who lived almost 3 kilometers from Winter Loft, a group of men passed by his cabin shortly before dusk. There were 7, maybe 8. They rode tired horses, their flanks covered with dry ice. One of them asked if the loft was still open. The woodcutter replied that it was, but advised them not to continue their journey so late. The man thanked him and said that the ladies were waiting. This phrase, recorded years later, became one of the last direct references to the twins before the horsemen disappeared completely. The reconstruction of what happened from that point on depends on fragments. There are no eyewitnesses from inside the winter loft. All that is known comes from sounds reported from a distance, vague observations, and subsequent deductions. The loft was a large space, divided into 2 levels. The upper floor, where hay was stored, was accessed by an external side staircase. The lower part, closed by thick wooden doors, served as a shelter from the wind. In winter, that space maintained a more stable temperature, albeit cold. According to consumption records, there was enough kerosene that night to keep the lamps burning for hours. The characteristic smell of this fuel, mixed with that of damp wood and old straw, probably dominated the environment. The floor, covered with uneven boards, creaked under the weight of footsteps. One of the most disturbing testimonies comes from a woman who lived on the other side of the hill. She stated that, on that night, she heard voices coming from the direction of the loft. Not screams, not cries for help. Just muffled conversations, interrupted by long silences. At one point, the sounds stopped abruptly, as if someone had closed a heavy door. After that, only the wind. The next morning, the snowstorm intensified. For 2 whole days, no one left their homes. The trails disappeared under thick layers of snow. The world was reduced to a small, silent, and motionless space. When the weather finally cleared, Briarcrest looked different. There was no movement of horses, no recent tracks, no smoke was visible near the loft. The first resident to approach the main path noticed something strange. Old horseshoe marks went only so far and then simply ended. There was no continuity. It was as if the horses had been brought inside and never left. When questioned days later, Abigail and Eleanor calmly and consistently stated that the riders had left before the worst of the snowstorm. They said they did not know their full names or their final destinations. They had only offered temporary shelter, as they always did. When local authorities arrived weeks later, they found the winter loft closed. The doors showed no signs of forced entry. Inside, there were food scraps, boot marks on the floor, and empty lanterns. Nothing indicated immediate violence. No bodies, no obvious stains. Just the feeling that something had been interrupted in the middle. The police report mentions a detail that almost went unnoticed. In the far corner of the lower space, there were signs of recently removed soil. The ground was darker, more humid. When questioned, the twins said they had made minor repairs to the floor because of accumulated moisture. There was no complete excavation. Winter made any deeper attempt virtually impossible. Thus, the case was temporarily suspended. The names of the riders remained unknown, their fates undefined, and the last confirmed record of that night remains the same. A group entering the path that led to the winter loft, followed by a silence that would never be broken again. When winter finally gave way, Briarcrest was no longer the same. The snow slowly receded, revealing warped paths, fallen fences, and a silence heavier than usual. The disappearance of the riders, until then treated as a common delay in times of extreme cold, began to take on more defined and more disturbing contours. The first families to seek news were those who lived outside the region. Letters arrived at the nearest post office asking about sons, brothers, and husbands who had promised to return before Christmas. None of them received a concrete answer. The names did not appear in subsequent passage records. There were no reports of deaths on nearby roads. It was as if those men had been erased at the edge of Briarcrest. Pressure on the authorities increased. A new investigation was opened in early spring 1894, this time with more time and fewer weather limitations. The winter loft was reopened and inspected more thoroughly. Boards were removed. The floor was finally excavated at specific points. What was found there was not enough to close the case, but enough to change its nature. Under one of the areas where the soil appeared darker, there were remnants of deteriorated leather, fragments of fabric, and a metallic object unrecognizable at first glance. After cleaning, it was identified as part of a saddle buckle. There were no complete bones, no intact bodies, Only signs that something, or someone, had been there longer than it should have. The twins were questioned again. Their statements remained consistent, almost excessively precise. They denied any conflict. They reaffirmed that the men had left in small groups on different days. When confronted with the objects found, they said they did not recognize them. They claimed that the loft had been used by many people over the years and that old remains could have been left there unrelated to recent events. Some neighbors began to speak up. One said that after the disappearance, he noticed a strange smell coming from the loft during the thaw, a mixture of damp earth and something else that was harder to identify. Another said he had seen smoke coming from the place at unusual times weeks before the investigation, even when the twins claimed not to be using it. None of these reports, taken individually, were sufficient for a formal accusation. The decisive element was missing: direct evidence. The investigation was eventually closed months later, on the grounds of lack of conclusive evidence. In the official files, the case was classified as unexplained disappearances in a climate-risk region. The Briarcrest twins were never formally charged. They continued to live in the same house for a few years until they quietly sold the property and left the area. For the community, the explanation was never satisfactory. What remained was a silent revelation, built not on a confession, but on the sum of absences. 28 men entered Briarcrest. None were seen leaving, and all that remained of them fit into a handful of hastily buried objects. The winter loft was abandoned shortly thereafter. Over the years, the wood rotted, the roof collapsed, and nature reclaimed the space. But in the records and collective memory, that place came to be referred to not as a shelter, but as an endpoint. And even without a definitive answer, one thing became clear to those who studied the case closely. It was not winter that made those men disappear. Decades later, when Briarcrest was nothing more than a name on old maps, a researcher found the box where this case had been forgotten. Inside, there was nothing extraordinary, just incomplete reports, unanswered letters from family members, contradictory statements, and blurred photographs of a wooden building that no longer existed. The winter loft appears in these images as an ordinary, almost mundane structure. No visible signs of violence. No obvious signs of anything exceptional. And perhaps that is exactly what makes the case so disturbing. Nothing there seemed significant enough to justify 28 disappearances. Nothing screamed for attention. The researcher noted in his personal notebook that the most enduring crimes are rarely those marked by excess. They are sustained by normality, by habit, in silence repeated until it becomes invisible. The Briarcrest twins disappeared from the records a few years after leaving the region. There are no clear death certificates. There is no news of arrests or trials. Only confirmation that they continued to live somewhere else, under other eyes, perhaps with other names. The file offers neither redemption nor punishment, only continuity. The horsemen, in turn, remained reduced to numbers and fragments. A name written on a letter, a rusty buckle, a piece of leather buried under the cold floor of a shelter that was meant to protect, not hide. Upon revisiting the testimonies, the researcher noticed a pattern that does not appear in the official reports. All the men were travelers. None had firm roots in Briarcrest. They were people passing through, easily forgotten, whose absences took time to be noticed. This detail, more than any other, explains how the case could remain unsolved. Today, there are no crosses, plaques, or memorials at the site where Winterloft once stood. The forest covers everything with the same indifference with which time covers human records. The wind continues to blow through the hills, repeating a sound that could be mistaken for silence. What remains of this case is not a definitive answer, but a discreet warning left among yellowed papers. When no one is waiting for someone, disappearance can seem natural. And perhaps that is why, more than a century later, the question still remains unanswered in the official archives, not about how those men disappeared, but about how many times the same silence was accepted before and after Briarcrest.